Nobody at Ashford Memorial Hospital ever really saw Elena Cross. She moved through the halls like a shadow that knew every corner of the building better than the people who'd worked there for decades. 34 years old, unremarkable on paper, a night shift trauma nurse who kept her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and never once complained about the double shifts nobody else wanted. The other nurses whispered about her sometimes, not cruelly, just curiously. She never went to the holiday parties. She never talked about her past. When someone asked where she trained, she'd say a small program upstate and change the subject before the sentence even finished landing. Dr. Marcus Webb, the hospital's golden boy trauma surgeon, barely acknowledged her existence unless he needed an 4-line placed faster than the resident could manage it. To him, she was competent furniture. Useful, replaceable, forgettable. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday night that started like every other Tuesday night, with the low hum of monitors and the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. Then the radio at the nurses' station crackled to life with a call that made the charge nurse go pale. A convoy had been ambushed 20 minutes outside the city. Army Rangers, 8 of them, torn apart by an IED that nobody saw coming. Multiple gunshot wounds, blast trauma, 1 man already coding in the field. The choppers were inbound, and Ashford Memorial, a mid-sized civilian hospital never built for this kind of carnage, was about to become a battlefield trauma center in real time. The bay doors burst open and chaos poured in. Blood-soaked stretchers, medics shouting handoffs in clipped urgent fragments, surgeons scrambling to triage 8 critical patients with only enough hands for half that number. Dr. Webb took one look at the scene and felt his confidence crack for the first time in years. This wasn't a car accident or a stabbing. This was combat trauma, wounds that didn't behave the way textbooks promised, arteries nicked in places civilian surgeons rarely trained for, shrapnel embedded at angles that made no anatomical sense. He barked orders, but his voice wavered, and the room could feel it. Then Elena Cross stepped forward, and something in her changed. Her spine straightened. Her eyes sharpened into a focus nobody in that hospital had ever witnessed. She didn't ask permission. She grabbed a set of forceps, knelt beside the ranger whose heart had just stopped on the gurney, and began working with a precision that looked less like nursing and more like something out of a field hospital in a war zone. She called out compressions in a cadence that matched military protocol exactly, the kind you don't learn from a manual, the kind that gets burned into muscle memory under fire. She identified a tension pneumothorax before the resident even finished reading the vitals, grabbed a needle, and decompressed the chest herself without waiting for a doctor's sign-off, because in that moment, waiting meant death. Dr. Webb froze, stunned, watching the quiet nurse he'd dismissed for years transform into the most competent person in the room. She moved from patient to patient, her hands steady even as blood soaked through her scrubs, calling out injuries with a vocabulary that belonged to combat medicine, not hospital charts. GSW exit wound, no arterial spray, he's stable, moved to the next. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't hoping. She knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had done this before, in a place far more dangerous than any hospital hallway. One ranger, barely conscious, looked up at her through the haze of shock and blood loss, and his lips moved. The word he mouthed made the nearest medic go still. Ghost, that was all he said, just that single word. But the way he said it, like recognition, like relief, like disbelief all tangled together, sent a ripple of confusion through the room that nobody had time to process. There was no time to ask questions. There were still 7 more patients bleeding out under fluorescent lights, and Elena Cross worked through all of them without a single wasted motion, without a single moment of hesitation, until the last critical case was stabilized and wheeled toward the OR. When the dust settled, when the adrenaline drained out of the room, and left only exhausted silence and the beeping of monitors, every single one of the 8 rangers was alive. Not stable in the fragile, uncertain way trauma victims often are when a hospital is simply lucky. Alive in the way that only happens when every decision in that chaotic first hour was exactly right. The kind of outcome that trauma surgeons write papers about, that hospitals use in fundraising campaigns, that should have made Elena Cross a legend by morning. Dr. Webb stood in the hallway afterward, staring at his own trembling hands, then at the woman quietly cleaning blood from her forearms like she'd just finished a routine shift. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice carried none of its usual arrogance. Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at him with something unreadable in her eyes, something tired and old and far heavier than her 34 years should have allowed. "Just a nurse," she said finally, and walked away before he could ask another question. But Marcus Webb wasn't the only one who noticed. Word of what happened in that trauma bay didn't stay contained. By morning, hospital administrators were fielding calls nobody expected, calls from numbers that didn't show up on caller ID, calls that ended with tight-lipped silence from the people who took them. And somewhere in a records office 3 floors down, a request had already gone out to pull Elena Cross's personnel file. What came back wasn't a file at all. It was a single red stamped notice that made the head of HR set down her coffee and go very, very quiet. "Classified. Access denied. Do not inquire further." The quiet nurse nobody noticed had just saved 8 lives in front of dozens of witnesses. And now, an entire hospital was about to learn that some silences exist for a reason, and some secrets don't stay buried no matter how many red stamps get pressed on top of them. By the next afternoon, Ashford Memorial felt different, charged with a tension nobody could quite name. Nurses whispered in corners. Doctors who'd spent years ignoring Elena Cross now watched her with a mixture of awe and unease, like they'd suddenly realized they'd been sharing hallways with someone they never actually knew. The story of the trauma bay had already spread through every department, embellished a little more with each retelling, but the core of it remained untouched because it didn't need embellishing. 8 critical patients. 0 deaths. 1 nurse who moved like she'd done it 1,000 times before, in a place far bloodier than any hospital. Administrator Diane Foss had been running Ashford Memorial for 11 years, and in all that time she'd never seen anything shake the building's foundations quite like this. She sat in her office that morning with Elena Cross's personnel file open on her screen, or what was supposed to be a personnel file. Instead of the usual scanned certifications, background check summaries and reference letters, there was a single page. A government seal. A case number instead of a name. And beneath it, 3 lines that made Diane's stomach twist. Personnel record sealed under federal directive. Unauthorized inquiry may result in legal action. Contact issuing agency for further information. There was no phone number. There was no agency name. There was nothing except the unmistakable weight of a door slammed shut by people far more powerful than a hospital administrator. Diane wasn't the only one digging. Dr. Webb, still rattled from the night before, had spent hours trying to reconcile the image in his memory of Elena Cross working with battlefield precision, with the meek, quiet colleague he thought he knew. He found himself pulling up old shift logs, staring at years of her employment history that suddenly felt like a carefully constructed cover rather than a career. Every gap made sense now in the worst possible way. The 18-month absence 4 years ago that she'd explained as a family emergency. The way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, at loud noises during trauma codes. The way she always positioned herself facing the door in the break room, a habit he'd noticed but never questioned. That evening, 2 men in plain dark suits walked into the hospital and asked to speak with hospital leadership. They didn't flash badges dramatically or make a scene. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make security straighten up and administrative staff go quiet. Diane met them in a private conference room, and within minutes, understood that this conversation was not a negotiation. The men, who identified themselves only as representing federal interests, explained calmly that Elena Cross's history was protected under classifications that superseded hospital policy, patient privacy law, and virtually anything else Diane might try to invoke. They weren't threatening her, not exactly, but the message underneath their careful, polite words was unmistakable. Some questions were not meant to be asked. Some silences existed to protect far more than institutional secrets. What Diane learned, in fragments delivered with visible reluctance, painted a picture that reshaped everything the hospital thought it knew about its quietest employee. Elena Cross had once served as a combat medic attached to special operations units, deployed to conflict zones so sensitive that even acknowledging her role violated multiple layers of clearance. She hadn't simply patched up soldiers behind the lines. She had operated in active combat, under fire, keeping operators alive in conditions where evacuation could take hours instead of minutes. Her skill set wasn't just impressive, it was the product of training reserved for the tiny handful of medics trusted to work alongside the most elite units in the country. And when her service ended, under circumstances still buried beneath classification, she had walked away from that world entirely and rebuilt herself into someone anonymous. A nurse. Ordinary. Overlooked. Exactly the way she wanted it. That word from the wounded ranger the night before, the one that had rippled through the trauma bay like static, suddenly made sense. Ghost. It wasn't confusion or delirium. It was recognition. Somewhere in the field, in some conflict the public would never fully understand, Elena Cross had earned that name. And at least one soldier in that ambush remembered exactly who had once kept people like him alive when nobody else could. Dr. Webb found her later that night on the hospital roof, the one place she went when she needed silence that wasn't clinical. He didn't say anything about the men in suits or the sealed file or the fragments Diane had reluctantly shared. He just stood beside her and finally said what he should have said years ago. "You're the best clinician I've ever worked with. And I never even bothered to learn your name properly." Elena allowed herself something close to a smile, tired but genuine. "Most people don't," she said. "That's usually safer for everyone." The hospital never got the full story, and it never would. The classified file remained sealed, the two men never returned, and administrators quietly agreed never to raise the subject again, not out of indifference, but out of respect for a silence that clearly mattered more than curiosity. Elena Cross went back to her quiet shifts, her unremarkable rounds, her carefully maintained anonymity. But something had shifted permanently in how people saw her. The nurse they'd overlooked for years had reminded an entire hospital that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who have already survived the loudest, most dangerous moments imaginable, and chosen silence not out of weakness, but out of hard-earned wisdom. If this story moved you, if you believe the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who never ask for credit deserve to have their stories told. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because stories like Elena's are exactly what this channel is built to tell. Drop a comment below if you've ever met someone whose quiet strength turned out to be extraordinary. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves. There are more stories like this one coming, and you won't want to miss them.